Good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. I see many familiar faces tonight and a couple who I don't know, so I want to just say hello. My name is Mathis Kelvin. I'm the superintendent here at Wayne. And tonight we're going to just get right into our presentation for the community. Tonight we will have the third presentation for the third portion of our comprehensive study. And tonight we're looking at transportation. And to share with us is Mr. Mark Walsh. Mark has been working with us very closely to look at and to study efficiencies around transportation. So I'm not going to go over his whole presentation. I'll let him do that. He's here and he's going to take some time with us in just a moment. Please note, before we start, that copies of the presentation, copies of the study are on our webpage under the comprehensive study of our webpage. You'll see it there. Just click on it. The study is about 75 pages, so just be forewarned if you want to print it all off. There's about 75 pages. Feel free. All the information is there. You have the same exact information there that our Board of Education has and that I have. And so certainly feel free to look there and you'll find all of the information. With that said, we're going to get out of the way. And if you would please, with me, welcome Mark Walsh tonight. Thank you.
Good evening. I appreciate you coming. As Dr. Kelvin mentioned, what I'd like to do is go through a summary of the presentation. 75 pages. There's an awful lot of detail. It is online. You're more than welcome to read it and review it. What I'd like to do is to hit some of the highlights. I will not read every point on a PowerPoint. Now, you're more than welcome to review the PowerPoint. What I'd like to do is give you the substance and an overview of our findings. I think it's important to realize the perspective that we offered. This is my 29th year of doing consulting work. We're in 21 states. It's over 500 districts. So the perspectives we're offering come from a range of experiences in districts of various sizes. So in many cases in the report, what I refer to is what I deem to be industry standards. Unfortunately, New York State doesn't publish industry standards, so most of the data is data that we have gathered, and it's standards based upon the experience that we've gathered in reviewing the school districts. In order to perform the study, we went through a detailed data collection process. We interviewed basically everybody who was willing to talk to us, as many times as anybody wanted to try to gain perspectives and input on the program and to get insights. Whenever it was required, we came back to the district for requests for additional information. I have to say the district was extremely responsive. They did an excellent job of providing information, and they were very good about answering detailed questions, and some questions required some work on the district's part, and I appreciate the work. I also spoke to the other two consultants, Dr. Seversky and Dr. Timms, to get their perspectives on your enrollment and get Dr. Tim's perspective on the financial conditions. General review of the demographics of the school district. You all know this stuff probably better than I do as residents of the community. You're a fairly typical suburban community. Size-wise, should be relatively average for New York State. You're running 661,000 miles in the last reporting period in a two-bell system. I did construct a report for ease of use to go through on a topic basis. So you'll see I've gone through the topics here and they're in alphabetical order. It's not an order for priority or for importance in the report. Your facility is a very good facility relative to student transportation in New York State. Has abundant capacity, certainly sufficient parking. You've got adequate and reasonable and appropriate security. And from my perspective, you have the capacity to assist other operations, other entities, if there was an opportunity to do that. So if the district had an opportunity to share with a neighboring or contiguous school district, or you had an opportunity to deal with a town entity or another governmental entity, you have the capacity and the space to do that given your current program. And should your program reduce in size in the future, you'd have even more capacity. Bottom line is the facility is not an issue, it's not a problem, and it probably in the future could be an asset. In the report, there's a lot of detailed financial information. You can't possibly read that on the screen. I don't expect you to. But in the report, I do go down through a detailed explanation of the numbers that are on this chart. And it's financial information gained from the state of New York in the state aid reports. It's over the 5-year time period. It shows the mileage for the report. It shows the various calculation ratios. It shows your expense factor, and it shows your cost per student based upon the enrollment. Along the bottom is the enrollment. Along the bottom is the cost per student on a gross transportation expense. As you know, your enrollment is going down. Your expense has gone up. As this chart demonstrates, the red over here shows your transportation expense per student. The blue designates the number of students in the district. You'll see there's an inverse correlation between your cost per student and your enrollment. If you look at a couple other key factors, as you look at New York State aid, New York State calculates aid, and I showed on a previous slide that you're receiving, what that says is 68.7%. That's the gross aid rate that New York State provides the Wayne Central School District. You can't impact that. That's an aid rate calculated by the state of New York. It's based on a number of factors. Most of it is based upon a wealth calculation in New York. It's nothing that the district can do anything about. New York State says, congratulations, we're going to pay 68.7% of your approved expenses. However, not everything in transportation is aidable. You do lose aid based upon what is called other purpose miles. Other purpose miles are basically athletic miles. So New York State looks at your athletic miles, it's a percentage of your total miles, and says, that's local taxpayer cost, you are going to lose some aid because of the number of athletic miles that you operate. The same type of calculation is done for what's called the non-allowable pupil decimal. If you transport students at less than 1.5 miles, you basically lose aid as a result of that. New York State says that as a district, you are required to provide transportation for secondary students at 3 miles and elementary at 2. New York State then comes back and says, we're willing to pay you aid on anybody over 1.5 miles. Anybody under 1.5 miles from their school is non-aidable. Now, it's not that simple a calculation. There's a form which is done every 3 years, and it calculates the number of students on the vehicle, and it takes into account the number of special ed students. It's a report that is required to be submitted by the district every 3 years, but it ends up reducing aid for New York State. The end result is you have an effective aid rate of 61.7%. So way back when, if people had been in the district for a while, there probably was a discussion way back when that transportation aid was 90%. Because everybody in New York State many, many years ago talked about 90% aid. You don't get 90% aid. You get 61.7% of your expenses. The financial condition of Wayne Central is something that you're very cognizant of. As you know, you have declining enrollments, and Dr. Seversky provided that report. As you know, you have revenue challenges. You have a pilot settlement with Gannett. There's obviously the risk of Gannett, and there's the risk of the sales tax share from Wayne County. You have other purpose miles. I just explained the other purpose miles and the relationship with athletics. Should your athletic miles stay the same? And athletic miles typically are pretty normal year in, year out. If you have real good years, you may travel more miles, and that's great. But in the long run, it doesn't change a whole lot. But if your base mileage, your route miles go down, so if you generate routing efficiencies, if you change your routing program, if you have continuous reductions in numbers of students, and as a result of that, your miles go down, then the impact of athletic miles increases because your total athletic miles is a ratio compared to your total miles. So what would end up happening is you would end up losing a greater percentage of aid should, in fact, your route miles go down, but your athletic miles stay the way they are. I'm not in any way suggesting you ought to change your athletic miles, so don't throw things at me. That's something that isn't talked about in school districts. But it does have an impact on your aid in the future. You have employment costs, which I've gone through in detail in the report, which are non-aidable. New York State pays aid on expenses that they deem to be mandatory. New York State says we'll pay aid on health insurance for drivers. New York State says that health insurance for family members is not mandatory. Therefore, we don't pay aid. So New York State does not pay aid on the cost of family benefits. It also does not pay aid on the legacy cost. And so those are incremental expenses in transportation. So again, your gross aid is 68.7, your effective aid is 61.7. As you're looking at transportation, the easy thing to do is to keep in mind that basically 62% of your expenses, you receive aid back from New York State. We did make recommendations in the report relative to budget controls and getting controls for trips and athletic expenses in some ways back at a lower level to those people who have the right to impact it. We did make recommendations relative to your operations and maintenance department or buildings and grounds and cross-invoicing. And this is something done, number one, is because it's appropriate, but number two is it could enhance your aid in transportation if, in fact, you're receiving more aid from buildings and grounds than what transportation is providing to buildings and grounds. So in other words, if you increased your transportation expense, you ought to get aid on that incremental cost. I also made a recommendation on the rate that you charge outside agencies. As you're providing work, for instance, summer rec programs, you have a rate per mile that you charge those programs. That's totally within the purview of the school district. You can do what you want. From my perspective, I believe it is appropriate to charge an outside agency what it actually costs you to operate a service. And that is especially important because there's an aid calculation. And I hate to keep mentioning aid, but we're talking about financial impact to Wayne Central. There is an aid impact for work being done for outside agencies, and you actually lost a little bit more aid than you gained in revenue because the rate per mile, I believe, was low. And I did provide a formula on what I believe would be more appropriate. In the area of fleet, you know what you have. You have 59 total buses, 43 group buses, and 16 spares. You have 4 buses that are basically dedicated to athletics in the afternoon because you run an extremely aggressive athletic program, and the athletic runs typically conflict with your PM runs taking kids home. I do believe that you need to address the distribution of spares. When you're looking at your 16 spares, a significant portion of those spares are mid-sized vehicles. So when you look, first thing we do when we look at a study is we look at the number of route buses and we look at the number of spare buses. Then within spares, you have to look, what are the size of the buses? And are they truly spares and are they appropriate? And in the report, I made a recommendation that that configuration should be modified in the future. During the last year, your average mileage was about 60,000 in your fleet. Your average age is 5.2. Statewide average is about 70,000, and statewide average is about 5.5 years. So you're very close to statewide average, and from my perspective, it's not an issue. You're seeking a replacement history at 10 years for large buses and 7 years for small. That's fairly normal in the industry. I think that's fine. I do believe that there needs to be a significant review of the elements that are considered when you're replacing vehicles. Age is simply one factor. You need to be able to look at utilization. You need to look at your fleet configuration. You need to look at historical repair cost, something the district is not tracking appropriately, in my opinion. And you need to be looking at the functional aspect of the vehicles much more than simply age. And we've made specific recommendations. We did make recommendations that you should be implementing fleet maintenance software. Software itself is relatively inexpensive. It gives you the ability to track parts and labor per vehicle. It gives you the ability to look at true historical repair costs. So each year when the Board of Education has provided a recommendation for fleet replacement, part of what transportation's responsibility should be is to say, here's what the bus was going to be used in the future. Here's what the current capacity is. Here's what my future needs are. Here's the historical repair cost. And oh, by the way, we have 2 buses that are older, but I've got 2 lemons in the fleet that I want to get rid of. And I can prove they're lemons because I can prove my historical repair cost. I did make recommendations based upon interviews about accelerating the replacement of your propane vehicles. I don't believe that it's something that you ought to be hanging on to. It's a disproportionate repair cost. You're not continuing in that environment. It would give you the ability to remove the propane tank. It is my understanding that you're intending to reduce the fleet by 2 buses this year, and I commend the district for that. I did make recommendations on looking at the potential for selling your used vehicles through the internet. It's a big thing now in transportation. It's had relatively good success statewide and something that the district may want to look at. You're aggressively replacing and implementing cameras. I applaud the district for it. The cameras are worth their weight in gold, and you ought to keep doing it. And you are purchasing extended warranties, a shade over $2,000 a vehicle, and right now, given your staffing, it's probably the best $2,000 you could spend. I made a significant number of recommendations on labor. You have 12 paid days off a year for drivers. Right now, during the current year, I think it was up through the beginning of May, on average, you were averaging 2 absences every day. I did make recommendations that the district look at an attendance incentive program. I know it's offensive to some people to think that you ought to pay people to come to work, but attendance incentive programs have been extremely effective in transportation, and we've made specific recommendations in the report. As I mentioned earlier, the state of New York does not look at the provision of family benefits as being an aidable or a necessary expense. During the previous year, you had $394,000 of expenditures for family benefits that were non-aidable. It's not reported in your transportation aid reports, and you do not get your 62% back on that approximately $400,000. You have a bid process for drivers that I've made a recommendation should be changed, not only from the standpoint of looking at pay rates and paying for what people really do, but also greater flexibility to share and integrate with neighboring school districts. I made recommendations that the department management ought to be very actively involved in developing proposals and reviewing any labor issues. There's an analysis in the report called an effective hourly rate. I'd prefer that you read it as opposed to me trying to explain it. But effectively, it takes the pay that you're paying individuals, it takes the benefit load, it takes the paid days off, it divides by the number of hours the drivers work, and your effective hourly rate in the district is $37.30 last year. I've made recommendations on a change in the future negotiations to look and consider a 2-tier wage and benefit program, and that's described in detail in the report. There's an error in my statement. It was my understanding subs are paid $15.24. I understand they're paid $15. I apologize. I don't think it's a significant difference, unfortunately, but it is wrong. Although I am very pleased that your sub drivers have the ability to take trips, it's appropriate and helpful as you're seeking subs. Probably the largest challenge to transportation as an industry is drivers. Finding, retaining, keeping, training drivers. It needs to be an ongoing effort. We made some recommendations in the report about ways to augment your driver recruitment. It is something that you can't wait till the last minute. It takes a long time to train them. Sometimes it takes even much longer time to get them licensed. And you have to find them. And it's something the district ought to be working at all the time. And so it's a recruitment process. It's tied to wage and benefit programs. It's tied to looking at the jobs, and it's tied to taking a look at the opportunity to provide drivers work. It is a very difficult problem. You're asking people to work basically 5 or 6 or 4.5 hours a day, 180 some odd days a year. It's challenging, it's difficult, it's demanding, and it's an area that many districts are suffering terribly trying to find drivers, and something I suggest the district constantly stay focused on. In the area of maintenance, you do have 3 mechanics. Your mechanics rotate shifts. I really commend you for that. Very seldom do I ever see a head mechanic who rotates shifts with the other mechanics. I love it. I love what you're doing, and I think it's highly appropriate. You're maintaining 59 buses plus 16 non-DOT vehicles. That's basically your buildings and grounds and your non-student transportation vehicle. When you're looking at non-DOT vehicles, from an industry standard, they're equivalent to about a half a bus. So if you look at it, you're relatively maintaining about 67 vehicles if you were comparing it to school bus maintenance. That provides you a ratio of 22.3 to 1. Industry standard right now is about 18 to 1. So right now you have more vehicles per mechanic than the industry standard. Yet your DOT passing rate is almost 98%. So your maintenance department is doing an exemplary job. Staffed, I think, appropriately. Your extended warranties help. Keeping your fleet rotated, improving your fleet would be helpful. I think getting rid of your propane buses would be helpful. Your extended warranties are a good thing in the program, and as I mentioned earlier, we do recommend that you implement maintenance software. The staffing level in the department is something we look at compared to industry standards. The number of people that you have in the department is appropriate. I did find the job descriptions confusing, but functionally your staffing is appropriate. I did make a recommendation that there be an annual meeting between the administrators in the school district with the drivers and aides. We've had an opportunity to put this in place in several districts, and it's proven to be extremely effective. It provides the administrators an opportunity to explain to the drivers why things are the way they are, what happens when a referral is submitted, how an administrator deals with issues, what are important things from the administrator's perspective that a driver or an aide can offer. Conversely, it gives the drivers and aides an opportunity in a group to ask questions like, how come when we submit conduct reports on Johnny, nothing ever happens? Talking about various training programs. So it's a meeting that we strongly recommend. We do think that you need to augment your training program. There's not the level of specialized training in the district that we'd like to see. You have begun an annual employee review program, which is highly appropriate, and I strongly recommend it. We have recommended a trip report system, and that's detailed in the document with all the elements of it. And we did suggest that one thing you ought to consider, and it would probably be a subject to negotiations, was to see if one or more coaches could drive small vehicles. As we get into policy and procedures and routing, I'd like to just make one quick comment, especially to the board. I'm an outside consultant. I understand that. I don't live in Wayne Central. The responsibility for making decisions on policy and procedures and what you do for your community is up to you. It's rightly within the purview of the Board of Education. New York State says that the district can do what it wants. It'll give you aid to a certain point, but the rest of it's up to the district. If you provide services less than the state mandated mileage, once upon a time the voters in Wayne Central needed to approve that, and I'm assuming that they have. But at this point in time and in the future, it's the board's responsibility to make a decision on the service levels provided to Wayne Central. Having said that, from my perspective in working with school districts, your level of service in this district is excessive. You are providing a significant level of service to the community, far and above more than what is normal and customary. The level of service and the specialized services that you are providing your citizens is nice. It's great. They're probably used to it. I don't in any way underestimate how difficult it is to change. It's hard to take things away from people once you've provided it, but it's inefficient, it's cost you money, and it limits your ability to look at strong refinements in your program and to generate the efficiencies that I believe that you need to do. So again, I fully understand it's in your purview. And when I leave here, you've got my written report and you can ignore the consultant. But from my perspective, I think the district ought to look at the level of service that you're providing. One of the first ways to do that is look at policy. Your board policies, in my opinion, need to be reviewed and augmented and modified. The policies need much greater level of specificity. And I think one thing that's extremely important is that it's the board's responsibility to establish the policy in transportation. That is your job. It is Transportation Department's job to implement your policy. But as a Board of Education, once you develop policy, it is my belief it's the board's responsibility then to support the department in their implementation. So if the district develops a policy and says this level of service that we will provide, and we will provide this service consistently and fairly and equitably to students in the district in like circumstances, it's the Transportation Department's job to then do that. And if people ask for exceptions, it is the department's job to say no. It is not easy. The department will take unbelievable grief. But in my opinion, it is critical that the board establish the policy and then be strong and supportive as the department implements it. The service levels far exceed the requirements. It was amazing to me the number of times I went through interviews from people throughout the district, and somewhere in the interview, the phrase happy came up. That the basic philosophy in Wayne Central is to keep everybody happy. I understand it. It's up to you as a district of whether you can afford it. New York State says, and the industry says, that you need to provide services fairly. You need to provide it equitably. Nowhere in any regulation have I ever read that what you're supposed to do is keep people happy. What you're supposed to do is to keep people provided the services that you've determined that they should have. If a transportation department makes judgments and decisions based on happiness, you will spend a lot of money, because they are going to provide services that are over and above what industry standards are and what requirements are. And that's effectively what's happening. Consistent levels of services are required. That is law. There are two phrases in New York State that deal with this issue. One is called like circumstances. So basically, if you have two students that are in identical circumstances, you are required to provide service to them equally, incomparably. They are in like circumstances. The other phrase used is comparability of service. It means exactly the same thing. You must provide services on a comparable basis to students throughout the district. You are not doing that. As I mentioned, I understand the difficulty of change. I understand how tough it is to make those kind of determinations. I believe that in your policy you need to address cul-de-sacs and you need to address private roads. You are not required by law to go on private roads. You have a right as a school district to go on private roads. Should you go on a private roads? And private roads are things like private roads in a trailer park. That's a private road. It's not turned over to the municipality. It's not maintained by the municipality. Could be a parking lot. Could be a shopping center. Those are private roads. Number one, as a district, you should have specific, explicit permission from the owner that your buses go on that property. You also should be talking to your attorney, in my opinion, talking to your attorney and talking to your insurance consultant on whether the insurance levels are appropriate, not only from the school district standpoint, but the owner of the private property. So it's an issue that I believe you should be addressing, and you should be addressing as part of your policy review. You are providing door-to-door service, basically door-to-door service every place, other than a few areas where you're not providing comparable service. For instance, as you go into trailer parks, it's my understanding there are parts of trailer parks where you're not providing door-to-door service. But yet throughout the rest of the school district, you basically are. If I look at door-to-door service, part of what you review when you review a transportation program is safety. It is significantly less safe to pick up at every driveway than it is to use group stops. Your greatest frequency of accidents is during loading and discharge of students. So if you can minimize the frequency of loading and discharging, you're better off. You've all got behind school buses in the morning and the afternoon. And my guess is there's been times in the morning that you're behind a bus and you say, oh my goodness, I'm behind the bus. And it's because you go down the road and you know that bus is going to stop for every kid on that road. And they're going to stop individually. And that kid could be 50 feet away, and they're going to stop again. And every time they stop, that red sign goes out, and you've got to stop, and you've got to wait. And those are situations that you get drive-bys, typically, where people pass stop school buses. So you try to eliminate the frequency of that. It helps with your traffic pattern in the community. It helps with the environmental condition because you're not stopping. And from an efficiency standpoint, every stop takes you 15 to 30 seconds. Depends on the driver and the situation and the demographics. But it takes time. But you're doing door-to-door service everywhere. Your private parochial, you are required by state law to provide transportation to private parochial locations within 15 miles, and that's triggered by having one student in the district within that 15-mile range. So if you're going west and you have one student on the west side of the school district and that student is 14.9 miles, any other student in the school district that wants to go to that private parochial can go. However, you are not required to provide door-to-door transportation for every other private parochial student in the school district to go to that location. You have a right as a school district to have a central pickup point. Highly appropriate. It's what most districts do. Wayne Central is doing door-to-door transportation for private parochial transportation. You are not required to do that. You have what you call cross-attendance zones. As you know, you have attendance zones for your building, and you have buses that go to the other attendance zones. Some of those buses go to attendance zones for dance classes, YMCAs, whatever. You are not required to do that. That's a district decision that you're making and a level of service that you have determined that you are going to make. I believe it's expensive, but it is expensive. I don't believe it is expensive. You're paying for it. It's an excessive level of service. I did, in the area of policy, recommend that you have a camera use policy. I know that cameras and utilization of cameras is appropriate and controlled in the school. There ought to be a policy on school buses of whether cameras can be utilized. You have an amazing level of service when it comes to what I call variable schedules, which basically means that if you want Johnny to go to a birthday party Tuesday afternoon, Johnny's going to go to the birthday party, and it doesn't matter where that birthday party is. I'm amazed that you're doing this. You have parents who will fill out a form, and you have a form that is in here, a before and after school form, about where you want your students to go. And by state law, you can require that by August 1st. On your form, I believe it says either June or July. But then it goes on in the form and it says, well, we're not going to process it at the end of August. But oh, by the way, if you call, we're going to do it anyway. You're transporting across attendance zones. You're providing levels of service you do not need to provide. You have a control factor in your form that is not really a control factor, and you don't enforce it. But throughout the process, it's consistent with the philosophy of the district in that there have been repeated requests. There's a level of expectation, and the responsibility of the department is to keep the populace happy. Again, this is not meant to, I'm an outsider. The board can do what the board wants to do. It is certainly within your purview, it's in your right, it's what you were elected for, and it's appropriate. My job is to look at efficiency and what's normal and customary. But your variable schedule practices impact safety. You have students riding buses in the afternoon that maybe have never met that driver before. That driver doesn't know who Johnny is. That driver doesn't know what looks right. Maybe the driver is going to drop off Johnny and there's a pickup truck in the driveway that shouldn't be there. Driver's not going to know that. Johnny's never been on his run before. Johnny may be confused, or there may have been a problem with a parent and confusion of drop-off. And all of a sudden, Johnny is one of these students that you can't drop off because there's not appropriate supervision. But it's because you're allowing all this variable schedule and all these changes. And think about being in a school building. You've got the clerical staff in the school building receiving phone calls every day about Johnny going to a birthday party. It's an extremely inefficient use of your building staff members. You have students who are missing runs. They're late in the morning, they weren't feeling good, they missed the bus. The district's historical practice is go back and pick them up. You have bus passes. Bus passes are highly appropriate. Bus passes are critical. It is very important that in the area of bus passes that a record be kept at every individual building. Unfortunately, I've been involved and was involved in a situation where there was a catastrophic accident on a bus. And unfortunately, what had happened is the bus pass had been provided to the driver. When the accident occurred, the bus passes were destroyed. The school district had no idea what students were on that bus or who to call. So it's very appropriate for all of your buildings to make sure and be very thorough, and I know in talking to the principals, they're cognizant of it, to make sure that there be a record in the school building of everybody who's taking a late run. You are utilizing routing software. You've had it for a while. You seem to be well trained and conversant in it, which is great. You're moving, I believe, to school tools for a student management system. It should be integrated with school tools so that you have a common database. So as students add or leave or are modified in the school district, it's not a manual entry in transportation, and so that your student management system and your transportation database are identical. We did a request a ridership audit. You folks were very good about doing it, provided us great detail. We did make recommendations you do it at least 3 times a year. As we showed in the report, your buses are significantly underutilized. Your average ridership was down in the 25 to 30% range on your bus capacities. Now, part of it is a time-space issue. As you're looking at a run, you have a certain amount of time to cover a route, and if there doesn't happen to be a lot of kids on those roads, you can't pick up kids who aren't there. At the same point in time, as you go down through and look at the reports that are in the appendix, you'll see that the vast majority of runs are significantly underutilized, that the loading factors of the runs are very low. From a technical standpoint, even though a bus may be a 66-passenger bus, many districts don't load secondary students to 3 to a seat. Seats are designed for 13 inches of what they call rump room. Well, you take a secondary kid with a backpack and a winter jacket, and you're not going to put 3 of them in a seat. So a lot of districts will look at secondary runs as being 2 to a seat, or instead of a 66 capacity bus, it's a 44 capacity bus. Even given that, if you go back and you look at the load factors, you have significantly underloaded your vehicles. Part of it is a pragmatic problem, that what you try to do is you try to make your morning and afternoon runs relatively identical. Drivers are cognizant of the students, and they know the routes. It's a logical way to operate. When you have kids getting on buses every day who aren't scheduled because they're going to a birthday party, you can't schedule to 100% load because you don't know how many kids you're going to transport. But there also needs to be a significant revision to your routes and a significant consolidation to the routes. And what I've stated in the report is I believe that if the district implements effective policies and you start getting a greater control over the numbers of students, the level of service that you're providing, in my opinion, a conservative estimate would be a decrease of at least 4 vehicles. It will not happen for September. I believe the district needs to look at policy and procedures first, but it could happen for September in 17. And when you look at your financial cost, a savings of 4 buses is a savings in excess of $200,000. I think you'll save 4 buses in a heartbeat. But it will require a procedural change, it will require policy changes, and it will require a lot of work on the transportation department's standpoint of looking at your routes with a fresh look at, say, instead of tweaking routes from one year to the next, we're going to fundamentally reroute the school district. We're going to start over. I will be more than happy to answer questions.
There you go. There you go. We'll take questions and answers now. Or we'll take questions from people.
Hi, Mark. My name's Phil McTighe. I'm on the school board here. You said our transportation aid rate is 68.7%, and our effective aid rate is 61.7%.
Yes.
Is that within the realm of normalcy that you've seen based on your experience, or are any of those numbers grossly out of whack?
Good question. The 68% you can't change. It is what the state says it is. No, I understand. The differential. Yes, I think I mentioned there. The differential is not alarming to me. Your athletics are fairly typical. That is a significant deduction. I think, as I mentioned in the report, the other major area of deduction is what's called non-allowable students. Those are students at less than 1.5 miles. For a district with the demographics of Wayne Central, I think that's probably appropriate. So from the rate spread, gross versus effective, appropriate.
Hey, Mark, I'm on the school board as well. I had 2 questions for you. I'm not sure where our policy is regarding guest passes, but is guest passes something that we could just abolish? I know.
Excuse me, what do you mean a guest pass?
Like you said, Johnny wants to go
Oh.
to the,
Yeah.
I call them guest passes.
Yes,
Because
yeah.
it's a guest rider that's on that bus.
Yeah.
I just find from my own work life that sometimes with parents coordinating it, she thinks Johnny's coming to her house, Johnny's mother thinks he's coming to Johnny's house. It creates an awful big issue. It's a lot of room for mistakes if it isn't caught. Is that something that can be done quickly, swiftly to make changes? And my second question, oh my gosh, senior moment.
That's all right. I'll give you a chance to think. I'll answer that one first.
Okay.
Technically, could it be done? Technically, it could be done tomorrow. Practically speaking is a different issue. You're talking about probably what will be deemed by the community to be a significant change in service levels. There will be a level of expectation in the community to do what you've always done. My experience with districts who are going about this is they discuss it. They involve the PTA or PTO or whatever it's called in Wayne Central. It's a discussion at the school board level, and there's detailed communications within the building, and then it's made very clear to transportation, here's the way you respond to inquiries, here's the way it's implemented, and we will support your implementation of the elimination of non-scheduled runs. What you're talking about is non-scheduled riders. These are students who are not assigned to that vehicle, and for whatever reason they're being moved on that vehicle. It's not a legal issue. You're not mandated to do it. Most districts don't do it. If you talk to many of your neighboring districts, especially if you went towards Monroe County, I think you'd probably be hard-pressed to find districts who allow it.
Well, the other issue is we have an awful lot of children with peanut allergies. The drivers aren't familiar.
Right.
Child sits in a seat where somebody else ate peanuts or something that they're allergic to. It creates a big issue. And being on the school board, it's one of my things I would like to see changed. My second thing is, could you just elaborate on what is a central point pickup for parochial school? Does the parent bring the student? So the parents would be responsible for some portion of the transportation, and then...
It could be the parents. For instance, let's say the high school is the transfer point, and you could get the students at the high school, you pick them up at the high school, and you take them to the location. It could be that as a school district, you decide that you want to provide some level of transportation, and maybe with the out-of-district run, it allows the student come in on your first tier, go to one of your first-tier buildings, be dropped off, and that's so they get the ride from home to the school building on the first tier, and then they meet the private parochial run if times work, and times are a problem. And at that point in time, they're then transferred to the private parochial run. But you are not required to go outside the 15-mile limit to do door-to-door transportation. You're not required to. Again, these are the technical answers as opposed to the pragmatic determinations of what policy and service levels you want to offer. Or maybe you do regional group stops. Maybe you go to the northeast corner of Wayne Central and you say there is a location that we can use for a group stop, and the 5 students in that geographic area go to that stop. So they're not coming all the way to high school, they're going to that one location.
Mark, my name is Ron Miller. I'm also a board member. Could you talk a little bit about the voters approving services above and beyond, what that means? It was a voter referendum at some point?
Yes, I assume so. Normally, it probably happened 30 or 40 years ago. Honestly, did I go back into your board records and check? No, I did not. But what's required in New York State, and the theory behind it, again, is New York State says by law that you're required to transport secondary students at 3 miles and elementary students at 2 miles. So by law, you got to do that. New York State then comes back and says, okay, we understand that that's pretty draconian. So we'll pay aid at 1.5 miles. Anything under that, because of the aid calculations, New York State says that's really a local taxpayer decision. Therefore, you're obligating, as a school, you are obligating your taxpayers to a level of expenditure that is going to be multi-year. Because it is a multi-year expenditure that you are contractually obligating your populace to, they are required to give approval. It's typically done, and it should be done anytime there was a change in walker distance. Now, you don't have walkers in the community. As you know, many school districts have housing contiguous to the buildings, and students are required to walk a certain distance. You don't require that. That's your choice. But that's a decision made by the taxpayers through a vote that says we have no walkers. Every student in the school district is eligible for transportation.
And that would typically be done at the time of the budget vote?
That's normally when it's done, yeah. And if a district, when I've worked with districts, if they can't find that it was ever approved, and they just don't know, then typically what's done is it's gone out with the next budget vote, and there is a line item in the budget document that says the approval of the budget includes the continual policy of providing transportation to all students in the Wayne Central School District.
Okay, thank you.
To follow up with Ron, Dennis Landry, I'm also on the school board. When you say 1.5 miles, do we get our aid per student or per mileage on the bus? How does that work? Because if you're driving by that student.
Driving by the student doesn't work.
Yeah, and pick them up, I mean, within that 1.5 miles.
No, not the way it works. New York State, as I mentioned, New York State, every 3 years, your transportation department, in fact, I think you had to do one this year. Didn't you, Fred? Yeah. Every 3 years, the state informs you that you are now required to submit your non-allowable report. And what you have to do is you have to look at your TransFinder software helps you. You have to look at those students who are less than 1.5 miles because they are not eligible for aid. And let's say, for discussion's sake, that you had a bus and all they did is pick up kids at 1.4 miles and less. And that bus ran 20 miles. That entire mileage, 20 times the number of kids, is non-aidable mathematically. Because New York State's not going to pay aid on those kids. And this is getting into the weeds a little bit.
It's based on each
It's
child.
based on a miles per student in a run with a asterisk that if there are special needs students, it modifies the calculation. Because special needs students are aidable.
One other thing, when you say we take 4 buses out and it's a savings of $200,000, actually that's a savings of $80,000 to the district because we're getting 120 from the state on that in aid?
Yeah.
I mean, I just want to make sure that
Yeah.
I understand that.
Yes, when I look at savings, like a $200,000 savings, I look at it from a gross expenditure standpoint.
So it's saving
And
the
part of the
state.
reason that I do that is because the way aid is paid. If you were to eliminate 4 buses for next year, and you saved $200,000 next year, from a cash flow standpoint, that's in next year's budget, because your aid is paid the year after. So your 120,000, which is what you would get on the 200, because you're at a 60% aid rate for easy math, that aid comes in the following year. So you'd have a 1-year blip of a $200,000 cash savings, effectively.
I'm Kim Warnert. I work in transportation. When you talk about the 1.5 mile, if we do a radius from OPOE, we encompass then crossing Route 104, 55 mile an hour roadway. Where do we now include the town into this for sidewalks and crosswalks? Who's in charge of maintaining the sidewalks?
Sidewalks
I mean,
have nothing to...
Those are things that will come into play.
No question. I'm not, nowhere here tonight have I recommended that you transport kids and move to 1.5 miles. What I've tried to explain is where aid is paid. There is a process in New York State called a child safety zone. A child safety zone is a procedure within New York State that allows a district to look at an area and, pursuant to a very detailed procedure set up by New York State, you can make a determination of whether an area is a safe area for students to walk. And if you qualify by New York State criteria and it is determined that that is not a safe area, then you can transport those students. So it impacts your aid calculation, but it also impacts the comparability discussion. That, again, is not an area that really hits Wayne Central because every student here is transported. It would hit a district if you had a strict walker distance. Let's say it's 1 mile, all students within 1 mile had to walk. Now creating an eligibility area becomes very important. Although I will tell you that a child safety zone is very difficult to qualify, and that was intentional. When New York State passed the law, State Education Department had to write the regulations to implement the law. New York State Education Department was not supportive of the law, and the regulations that were implemented are difficult. A 55-mile-an-hour road, and what happens in child safety zones is you have a whole set of criteria. You look at traffic, so you'd have to get traffic counts, and you get those from the Department of State and 104. You look at road speeds. You look at whether there are or not sidewalks. You look at line of sight. You look at other issues. Are there curves? Are there hills? Which direction is the sun coming from? There's all these elements that are calculated. Each element, if you qualify, is a number of points. And whether you're an elementary student or a secondary student, you have to get a certain number of points to qualify. It is very difficult. The story that I tell districts is we've done child safety zones. There was a district that was it was a rural road. It was about almost a 90-degree curve. There was no sidewalks. It's rural. It was, I think, 45-mile-an-hour area, and it didn't qualify. Oh, and it was next to a railroad track, and it didn't qualify. But that was intentional. Now, would 104 qualify? Yeah, but again, it doesn't impact Wayne. You're transporting every kid. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that you can't do group stops. Group stops are not impacted by that. Group stops is the district, it's incumbent upon the district to make a determination of where group stops are safe. And as you know, your transportation department is eminently qualified to make that decision. So you would go out looking for group stops. You would make determinations based upon what's safe and what's reasonable. The board would typically develop a policy that says, we are going to require students, we are going to recommend the use of group stops, and maybe you separate it for elementary and secondary, which would be appropriate. And you say that I'm going to make secondary students, a secondary student could walk up to 3/10 of a mile to a group stop, and an elementary student can walk 2/10 of a mile to a group stop. And transportation now has a guideline. And now they can go out and start looking and saying, where is the appropriate place to put group stops? There will still be some door-to-door pickups. Demographically, you've got some areas where group stops don't work. But you have other areas where group stops do work. And for every one that it does, you save gas, it's safer, it's more efficient. But the board needs to make the determination. And then to members of the board, and I'm not trying to preach to the choir. If you make that decision, I strongly encourage you to support your department, because boy, are they going to take heat. Because they're going to get phone calls, and you're going to get phone calls, and parents are not going to be happy. And I can tell you the first phone call is going to say, I can't see Johnny out my front window. You've got to pick him up because I can't see Johnny outside my front window. It is the parent's responsibility to get the child to the bus legally. It is not yours.
We have that in the framework, and we did this a couple years ago. We went to even further out on school staff. And that was the question. I can't see that my child got on the bus. And the reply we get is, then you need to walk your child to the bus stop.
Yes.
And wait there.
But again, the moral of the story from my standpoint is if you develop that policy, which I think you should, and you implement the policy, which I think you should, but again, it's within the purview of the board, not me, then you better support your transportation department because they're going to have a tough year.
Other questions from anyone else?
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thanks. Thanks.
And just a reminder, the full report is on the webpage under comprehensive plan, and also the video from tonight will be posted there beginning tomorrow as well. So any questions or thoughts, you certainly can go right on the website. You can see this presentation replayed again and the other information. With that said, I believe we're all set tonight. Okay. Thank you all for coming tonight. Have a good night.